Welcome to Political Perspectives. I'm Hugo Gurdon, Editor-in-Chief of the Washington Examiner. If you're joining us on YouTube, please subscribe and like the page. I'm joined today by Jim Antle, who is Executive Editor of the Washington Examiner magazine. And Jim, we're meeting 3 days after, on the third day of the second Trump presidency, and he has come in like a whirlwind. There's just an extraordinary number of executive orders, just an absolute blizzard of activity. People describe it as shock and awe, and I'm sure there's been both shock and some awe as well.
Yes.
But what is the thinking here? Why such activity immediately?
Well, I think one is simply to have a dramatic show of force, to come in as better prepared as they were last time, much better prepared than they were, and to really flood the zone. So last time they sort of released some of these executive orders more piecemeal, and I think the feeling was, particularly with the travel ban from a select group of Muslim majority countries where there were terrorism concerns, that some of these orders then got picked apart. So now they're showing that they're very serious about doing all of the things that they promised to do by acting on a wide variety of fronts, but at the same time, there's such a volume that their critics will have difficulty. Obviously, there are things like the pardons that they'll be able to single out, but are going to have trouble picking their spots in terms of counter-messaging for this.
All right, so it's as it were such a blitz. Mm-hmm. They're advancing on so many fronts that the resistance will find it very difficult to fight on all of those fronts, and some will get through. Do you think that there are any which are any of the executive orders or moves that the Trump administration has made which are almost intended as sacrifices that will create such opposition and perhaps are fairly easy to push back on? For example, the birthright citizenship one, that those are being offered up as sacrifices so that people ignore some of the other things.
I mean, I think they hope that they can keep the birthright citizenship and not have birthright citizenship used as a mechanism for making it harder to remove illegal immigrants simply by virtue of them having children who are born in the United States. But from a judicial perspective, it is a heavy lift. If it weren't for the fact that it's being combined with so many other different immigration moves, you could potentially dismiss it as performative, but it's part of just such a comprehensive thing that they're doing to show that they want to be serious on enforcement. Many of these things will definitely stand, but certainly a lot of them are pretty contentious.
But speaking of contentious, and you just mentioned the pardons. Mm-hmm. We have editorialized at the Washington Examiner that this was a highly regrettable move to issue what amounted almost to a complete blanket pardon for everyone. There is a handful of people whose cases I think are being looked into. But before the pardons were issued, many people who surround Trump, including J.D. Vance, said that there would be a distinction made between violent and non-violent offenders. It's certainly the case that the demonstrators on January 6th were hounded, and there was, I think that a lot of people would agree that there was extra emphasis on prosecution and punishment for people who had committed non-violent offenses such as trespass, etc. Mm-hmm. And that there was it was appropriate that there should have been some pardons and commutations, but to pardon people who, for example, threw homemade explosive devices at the police or beat police with metal bars and things like that, mm-hmm. was an extraordinary thing, and immediately undermines the rule of law in a way that I think that embarrasses some of the people close to President Trump. So that, for example, when the new Secretary of State Marco Rubio was being interviewed by George Stephanopoulos immediately after his confirmation unanimously in the Senate, he was asked about this, and he was clearly trying to deflect, didn't answer those questions, was embarrassed by them. Isn't this an unnecessary self-inflicted wound immediately after he comes in by Trump?
Well, I mean, I think even apart from the merits of whether some of the more violent offenders on January 6th should have received clemency, there is also just the political question of why does it benefit Trump to having just come back to office, having won, having defeated his political opponents, why does it benefit Trump for the focus to be on 4 years ago rather than on right now? I do think they were hoping to achieve a certain level of flood the zone with this as well. So while it would have made more sense, and a lot of people had signaled that they would be looking at these on a case-by-case basis, I think Trump was always sort of sympathetic to more or less blanket pardons. And I think they wanted to get this story out of the way one time and not have these trickling out and having it relitigated each time. But it's definitely the most negative headlines for Trump since he's resumed office do focus on the January 6th.
It was very interesting that those pardons came, I don't know, perhaps 24 hours or less after he had been inaugurated. There were a bunch of pardons that were issued about 15 minutes before he became president by President Biden, which were essentially blanket pardons for any crimes committed all the way back from 2014 up to at the end of the Biden presidency. These had always been expected. People thought he's not going to allow any of his family who may have committed crimes or who indeed did commit crimes to be punished. The Biden pardons and the Trump pardons, so close together, make the case, do they not, for at least some examination of the presidential pardon power and whether or not it should somehow be curtailed, limited in some way.
Absolutely, I think that it shows how one excess sort of leads to another, right? So Biden justified many of his pardons on the basis that Trump might at some point politically persecute the people who were the recipients of the pardons. Trump justified his pardons of the January 6th defendants on the grounds that they were being singled out politically because they were his supporters, as opposed to Black Lives Matter protesters or various left-wing protesters who may have engaged in violence, and that there was real persecution that had already taken place from the Biden Justice Department and former Attorney General Merrick Garland. So when you look at these things, the pardon power being used as sort of a partisan tit for a tat, it does make you wonder, will there be a serious push to reform that power?
Yeah, it certainly seems to open it up. It certainly seems like it should open it up. And there's one other, I think, very troubling aspect of what President Trump has done in the immediate aftermath of his inauguration. And the Washington Examiner was the first to report many months ago of an Iranian plot to assassinate John Bolton, former head of the National Security Agency, National Security Advisor. He's had his Secret Service protection withdrawn.
Right.
This is an immediate contradiction, as we have written, of Trump's promise that there would be free speech would be protected. What Bolton did, he was very critical of President Trump, clearly said that he should not be the president, and then his life is not less in danger because after Trump's victory, it is the same people who have plotted his assassination, who have in Iran, who have wanted to assassinate President Trump. This again just looks like revenge, doesn't it?
It does, and it sits uneasily alongside a lot of Trump supporters' denunciation of the Democrats in Congress, who wanted to pull then former President Trump's Secret Service detail on the grounds that they might be able to get him on some of these criminal charges and he could be convicted of a felony. And then naturally there were at least 2 assassination attempts that we know of, and one in which that Trump was actually shot.
Yeah, both sides inveigh against the politicization of the justice, the Department of Justice, and the politicization of areas of government which should not be politicized. And yet it seems that we are now in a political environment where both are doing that, and it really is a moment to pause and be very careful and consider these things. Jim, that's where we'll leave it for this week. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us on Political Perspectives. Again, let me remind you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like the YouTube channel, and come back and join us again next time.